also other people than those 6 that joined us yesterday. It is those we need to listen to, and it is those that are the hope for us today. And now here today, we ask you to listen very carefully to the science, because this is the science that we need right now and that we see is missing from negotiations that are far beyond where we need to be and that don't seem to understand that we are in a crisis that gives us no further single day of negotiations to lose. So, as we're here, I'm very, very happy to welcome you again here with us. Thank you for coming on such short notice as well. It is a real pleasure that you're as spontaneous and than Greta and me. To start off with, I'm very, very happy to welcome Co Barrett. She's the vice chair of the IPCC. It is a pleasure having you. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts.
Thanks, Louisa. Thank you very much for this invitation to join you today on this important discussion for science. So I'm here today with my dear friend Yuba Sakona, representing the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an organization formed over 30 years ago to provide periodic summaries of what we know about climate change. Every 6 or 7 years, volunteer scientists from across the world come together to assess the knowledge that has emerged and share what we know with the world. The objective of our reports is to provide decision makers at all levels with scientific information that they can use to develop climate policies. As such, each of our reports contains a short summary written with policymakers in mind. It provides a synopsis of the key points highlighted in our comprehensive reports. The IPCC has been engaged in our most intense period of scientific assessment in our history. Over the last 15 months, we've released reports about 1.5 degrees of warming, the interactions between climate change and land, and the impacts of climate change on the ocean and the frozen parts of our planet. Taken together, these reports show the many changes that are already happening across our shared planet, from the highest mountains, the most remote polar regions, across the land to the bottom of the ocean. Pretty much everywhere we look, we see the effects of human-caused climate change, even and especially in the most remote corners of our planet. Think about that. The evidence of climate change is that far-reaching. Our most recent report found that for decades, the ocean and frozen parts of our planet have been taking the heat for climate change, which is melting ice sheets, shrinking glaciers, warming our oceans, and rising our seas. Our oceans have been acting like a sponge, absorbing 20 to 30% of total anthropogenic CO2 emissions over the last decades, changing ocean chemistry and making it more acidic. This has effects on fisheries and impacts millions of people who depend on the ocean for sustenance. These are just a couple of examples of the kind of science the IPCC provides to inform decisions. Yuba and my other colleagues will share more. I want to highlight, though, in the IPCC, we draw upon scientists from across the globe, much like the youth initiatives do. We've come to understand the value of having a diversity of perspectives involved in our processes. Scientists and experts from across the globe, all genders, indigenous communities, and now the voices of youth. Research and our own experience has shown that such diversity in perspectives makes the research more robust and more representative of our global understanding of climate change. That's why it's so important to see the youth engaging. You are bringing a new perspective to science and decision-making. On this podium, in the audience, across the globe, youth movements have catapulted the science-based conversation forward. You understand the science, you communicate it in ways that people understand, and you use scientific facts to underpin your calls for action. Thank you for being effective ambassadors for science. I hope it will inspire the next generation of scientists to help further our understanding of climate change, its impacts, and its solutions. I hope you will continue to listen to the scientists, but I also want to encourage you to talk with us. Tomorrow, the IPCC will be hosting a Twitter chat live from our IPCC pavilion at 4 p.m. local time to answer questions you have about the IPCC and climate science. Please join us. Together, we make science stronger. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kara. This has been terrific hearing your words. And yes, let's speak with the science and listen to the science, both in a very conscious way. Next, I'm very pleased to invite Shivan Karthar from the Stockholm Environmental Institute to share your thoughts. Thank you so much for making it today.
Thank you, Louisa. And thank you, Greta, for sharing this platform that you've really earned with your passion and by inspiring so many people. I truly appreciate that. I've been lucky enough also to be involved in the IPCC as an author for 2 cycles. And as Ko said, there was a report focused on 1.5 degrees and what it would mean to keep warming below 1.5 degrees and what it would mean to exceed warming of 1.5 degrees. But a lot of people have become worried about this, about the Earth possibly warming more than 1.5 or even more than 2 degrees. But there are also a lot of people who just aren't so worried because that actually seems like very little, just a couple degrees. And it's hard for normal people living their normal lives to really get worked up about a few degrees because so much bigger temperature swings happen every single day everywhere. In fact, the temperature is going to warm by more than 10 degrees here in Madrid today between the morning when we woke up and mid-afternoon or so. And in fact, if we decided not to worry about climate change at all, if we didn't bother about greenhouse gases whatsoever and we just continued to dig up fossil fuels and burn them and to leak methane from pipelines, if we did nothing at all to stop climate change, best estimate is that the world, as we released more and more greenhouse gases, would warm maybe 5 degrees or so. And to many people, that just doesn't seem like that much. But our normal human ways of thinking about temperature and little temperature changes just break down when we try and think on the scale of the whole planet and what it would mean to add enough energy to the planet to warm it by 5 degrees. Let me put 5 degrees in another light. When the Earth was in the depths of the last ice age, when there were sheets of ice 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, 4 kilometers thick over large portions of the world where there are now major cities with huge populations, and when coastlines were tens of kilometers or hundreds of kilometers from where they are now, the world was only about 5 degrees colder than it is now. That's right, the temperature only had to warm by about 5 degrees, just nudge up by 5 degrees to come out of that frigid state, to melt those several kilometer thick ice sheets, to rearrange ecosystems across continents, to drive some species extinct and to allow others to emerge. It, in fact, transformed the surface of the Earth to warm by just 5 degrees. And the Earth then settled into a nice, stable climate that, as it turned out, was hospitable to the emergence of human civilization. So what will happen if we humans cause that to happen again? Another 5 degrees of warming. What would happen if we caused the world to spin off into whatever the opposite of an ice age is? Or even halfway there, 3 degrees, 4 degrees. Well, we don't know. We can't know. Not with any kind of reassuring confidence. We've never seen that. We've never been there. We don't know how coral reefs that protect our shores and anchor the ocean's food webs would respond, especially while oceans are acidifying at the same time. We don't know how much power and force hurricanes would then pull from the much warmer oceans. We don't know how the South Asian monsoon would change and what will happen to 1 billion plus people whose crops that monsoon waters. We don't know how fast and furiously wildfires will rage in forests that are suddenly in climate zones where they're not supposed to be. And anyone who thinks that we know what it will be like, in fact, that we know well enough to predict the costs of allowing that to happen, and who can decide, oh, we can afford that, or decide on behalf of others that they can afford that as it happens, that's not science. That's looking at an existential risk to humankind and deciding to take a gamble. That's madness. And we can't let that happen. Thank God it doesn't have to happen. We have technologies we need, we have the money we need, and we can invest in the alternative sources of energy to meet our needs so we can stop digging up those fossil fuels. But access to those technologies and financial resources is really, really concentrated because we live in such an extraordinarily unequal world. The richest 10% gets more than half of the world's income each year and causes more than half of the world's pollution each year. But emissions all around the world, not just among that 10%, needs to get to zero. Even among those whose emissions come from daily activities that merely help them get their basic needs met and merely help them make a modest livelihood. The only way that we can make emissions go to zero around the whole world is if the world's more privileged inhabitants, those who have benefited as their societies have developed and gotten prosperous and burned lots and lots of fossil fuels, if they eliminate their emissions, and if they also extend the support to the rest of the world, to those who are less privileged and who consume less and who emit less, to enable them to do the same. Not only is that really the only fair way that it can be done, but it's also the only practical way. It's the only way it can get done. It's the only way that the whole world can be convinced that we're in this together, we're fighting a common battle, and that we're helping each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. And thank you also for pointing out and underlining the aspect of inequality in the climate crisis and in the climate science, which is often overseen. Next, I'm very, very delighted to ask William Moomer to share your thoughts. William Moomer was one of the 5 authors of the World Scientists' Warning on a Climate Emergency, endorsed by over 11,000 scientists from across the globe. He's also at the Fletcher School. Thank you so much for making it today.
Thank you, Louisa, and thank you, Greta. We did not invent the term climate emergency. You did. We were greatly influenced. We, the scientists, were greatly influenced by that. We thought, well, should we call it a climate crisis? Should we call it a climate disaster? That leaves people with nothing. Climate emergency implies something serious is happening or about to happen, and we have a responsibility to try to stop it. That urgency, we see it around here. The time is now, time for action. It's all over the signs. And yet, what do we see but ongoing negotiations that are not leading to action? Let's be clear. We're no longer talking about climate change. The climate has changed. These young women here were born into a different climate than I was born into. And they will see a different climate than I will live long enough to see. This change in the climate is actually a symptom It's a symptom of the unsustainable way in which we have been unraveling the fabric of life on this planet. We have been destroying the forest that, like the oceans, are responsible for absorbing more than a quarter of all the carbon dioxide that we emit every single year. Isn't it amazing? We put 11 billion tons, we humans put 11 billion tons in the atmosphere, and it only increases by less than 5. Who has been helping us? The oceans, the forests, the wetlands, the grasslands. And we are in the process of destroying them. So why would 5 scientists, 1 from South Africa, 1 from Australia, 2 from the state of Oregon, and 1 from the state of Massachusetts, decide to write something like this? And how in the world, I'm asked, did you get 11,000 scientists to agree? My response is, it's nearly impossible to get 11 scientists to agree on just about anything. We just put this up on the internet. 11,000, more than 11,000, and another 1,000 since then have signed on. From 153 countries, from China, from India, from Ethiopia, from Brazil, from the United States, one of the worst offenders, obviously, the European Union, actually in second place in terms of total emissions of carbon dioxide since the Industrial Revolution. So let me just, since I don't have much time, let me just focus on one thing. We listed, obviously we have to reduce emissions. Reduce emissions of all our energy use. Not go to net zero, go to zero. Let me say something about the myth of climate neutrality. Climate neutrality means that I can continue emitting and someone else, someplace else, at some other time will somehow plant enough trees or do something to remove that amount of carbon dioxide. Now, not all of you may be proficient in higher mathematics, but you don't need to be to understand the simple fact that in order to meet the 1.5 degree goal, we must reduce our emissions by 7.6% a year for the next 10 years. You cannot do that with carbon neutrality, right? If we continue to cut down our forest, continue to subsidize our fossil fuels, continue to subsidize the cutting down of forest, to burn them to replace fossil fuels in our coal plants in Europe and the United States, we're not going to get there. The myth of carbon neutrality for bioenergy is exactly that. It's a myth. And here in Europe, it is leading not only to the destruction of forests in places like Estonia and Lithuania, but in the United States, we ship 12 million tons a year for a single power plant in the UK. That's out of our forests. UK doesn't get charged with that because of the fault of the mistaken accounting system we have. The United States is supposed to report it. We don't have to because we refuse to be a party to the Kyoto Protocol. Loophole after loophole after loophole. And today, and the rest of this week, there will be negotiations over more loopholes. Will some countries be allowed to double count the forests they grow that someone pays them to protect and then count it as their own? Will we adjust the baseline so that basically some countries get to start, as someone said, halfway down the track in a race rather than back at the beginning with everyone else? We cannot afford any more of this. And I just want to say, as scientists, and I can obviously not be inside the head of all 11,000 scientists who supported this, but I think all of them would agree, we have to stop dithering over creating more opportunities to put more carbon in the atmosphere and subsidize it. By the way, all of these countries are subsidizing the fossil fuels. Subsidies went up since 2010, not down, for fossil fuels. And they are increasing for bioenergy as well. Nearly 800 scientists in January of last year wrote to the European Parliament and asked to remove the subsidies for bioenergy and were ignored. All of us bear blame for this. Let's not play the blame game. Let's just get on with solving the problem. I first learned of climate change in the 1960s. I first taught a course that included it in 1970. I began to work full-time on climate change in 1988. These two young women here should not have to live their lives having to work on climate change till they're my age. Thank you.
Thank you so much, William. I agree. Next, I'm very, very happy to have Rachel Cletus with us. She is with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Thank you so much for making it, Rachel. Stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here today with this panel. Thank you for creating the space for science to have a voice here, Greta and Luisa. I'm Rachel Cletus. I'm with the Union of Concerned Scientists. I'm an economist. And what I think about a lot is the human implications of the changes we're seeing in our climate. Not just changes, as others have said, this is a crisis. This is an emergency, and it's here and now. Young people today who are graduating from high school have not known a world without record-breaking global average temperatures. 2019 is on track to be the second or third warmest year on record. That means that we've had 19 of the warmest years on record since 2001. Lifetimes of the young people here on the stage today. And as we've heard from Ko and Shivan, this has meant that we're seeing changes around us, in many cases happening much faster than scientists thought even 10 years ago. We're seeing record Arctic ice loss. We're seeing record temperatures, oceans warming, effects on ecosystems. As the oceans are warming, we're seeing marine species being affected. We're seeing oceans acidifying. And this is not just about the science that the IPCC produces, which is very, very important. This is also about the lived experiences of people around the world. This is about traditional knowledge that indigenous people have for a long time held and the changes that they themselves are seeing in their world. So when we talk about record ice loss, or when we talk about ocean acidification, who is on the front lines of these changes are these indigenous peoples, these frontline communities who know that climate change is happening. And this is why it's so reprehensible and shameful that my government continues to deny the science, has gone as far as to announce its formal intent to withdraw from the Paris Agreement at a time when the urgency to act couldn't be more vital and important. Today is Human Rights Day, so no more appropriate day to highlight that the human toll of climate change is really severe and significant. People are already suffering and dying because of climate change. Livelihoods are being destroyed. Many millions of people are being displaced by extreme weather and climate-related disasters. Water supplies are being threatened, food supplies, ecosystems are in distress. The Lancet Countdown report just released pointed out the public health impacts of climate change, particularly for young children and the elderly. We're just at over a 1 degree Celsius increase of global average temperatures, and the effects are already profound. This year alone, we've seen a depressingly familiar and devastating series of climate-related extreme weather events, including the record drought in Zambia, wildfires in Australia and California, hurricanes Dorian, cyclones Idai, Kenneth, and Fani, typhoon Hagibis, record-breaking heat waves in Europe and the Arctic, flooding in the US, Bolivia, India, Iran. And unfortunately, scientific projections show that these impacts will worsen, even more so if we fail to sharply curtail our heat-trapping emissions. Every fraction of a degree we can avoid matters. We are the cause of the problem, and so we must take the responsibility to solve it, as Greta, Luisa, and so many young people around the world are demanding. And the word is demanding because they are outraged that the adults are not taking actions that they should have years and years ago. And that's why it's really troubling to see the disconnect in this COP between what's happening in the rooms here and the action that we need outside in the world. The recent UNEP emissions gap report showed that we're far off track from where we need to be in terms of cutting emissions. And at the rate we're going, we're set for over 3 degrees, maybe even 4 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. We know how to do this. We have many of the solutions available to us right now. We need to ramp up energy efficiency, ramp up renewable energy, electrify as many end users
This is the primary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the primary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the primary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the primary audio circuit.
Hey there, this is Bart from The Hill. So we are live now, and I think it's going to be for about 15 to 20 minutes. And it's the arrivals of the ICJ. Okay, ciao. It's Bart, okay, ciao. Oh là là, fais gaffe aussi, oui. T'as pas le droit de filmer devant. Ok. Mais moi j'avais déjà essayé. T'es venu.
But you know what's changing? What's changing is the powerful, diverse movement for climate action that we're building around the world. Scientists are getting off the sidelines. You know, they understand what's at stake. They're advocating for climate solutions now. They're joining a very diverse group of people: indigenous people, youth, labor, forward-looking businesses, faith communities. And that momentum that we're creating, that's going to be the unstoppable piece that's going to drive climate action forward. How we do this is really important because, as Shivan pointed out, deep within this climate crisis is the problem of inequity, long-standing inequity, racial injustices, and discrimination around the world. We're not going to solve this problem unless we build equity in. It's essential, not just nice to have. And as we transition away from fossil fuels, we've got to treat fossil fuel-dependent communities and workers fairly. We've got to invest in a just transition around the world to make sure that those who've helped keep the lights on in our countries for all these decades are not left behind in this transition to a low-carbon economy. So equity and climate justice, the core of our solutions. And I'd like to end on a personal note. I am here not just as a climate expert, I'm also a mom. My kids are 11 and 13. And like many young people around the world, they too are climate activists. And you know, I say that with pride, but also with a great sense of grief, that our children have to fight for that future. So let us adults get off the sidelines. Let's put our shoulders to the work with them. Let's make sure that our kids have the future in which they can prosper and not be afraid of runaway climate change. And let's call out our politicians who are not acting in the interests of people and are remaining beholden to fossil fuel interests. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It is indeed strange that the disconnect between the movement on the street and the negotiations here in these rooms seems to have never been bigger than in these days when everyone talks about the climate. Finally, I'm very happy to invite Yuba Sakona, who's the IPC Vice Chair and from the South Center, to share your thoughts. It is incredible to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Lisa and Greta, to invite us to this conversation. This is very important here at the COP25 in Madrid. Over the last 2 years, the IPCC, at the request of the government, has released 3 special reports focusing on warming of our planet and how climate change is interacting with the land, the ocean, and the cryosphere. When the IPCC released the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius a year ago, it confirmed that climate change is already affecting people, ecosystems, and livelihood all around the world. It found that limiting warming to 1.5 is possible within the laws of this chemistry and physics, but would require unprecedented transitions in all aspects of society. It shows that there are clear benefits to keeping warming to 1.5 rather than 2 degrees or higher, meaning that every bit of warming matters. And it shows that limiting warming to 1.5 can go hand in hand with other goals, such as sustainable development, poverty alleviation, which is why every year matters and every choice matters. We know that without ambitious mitigation effort leading to a sharp decline in greenhouse gas emission by 2030, global warming will surpass 1.5 in the following decades, leading to the loss of fragile ecosystems and challenges for the most vulnerable people and societies. This is why every choice matters. Some of these choices were further explored in the report released this year. For instance, the special report on climate change and land found that humans have already placed immense pressure on land, and that climate change is adding to this pressure. But the land we already use could feed the people in a changing climate and provide biomass for energy. We can do that through more sustainable land use, reducing other consumption and waste of food, eliminating the clearing and burning of forests, preventing over-harvesting of fuel wood, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, thus helping to address land-related climate issues. When looking at the other part of our world, the special report on the ocean and cryosphere found that there is overwhelming evidence that the 1 degree warming we have already experienced is resulting in profound consequences of ecosystems and people in the ocean and in the frozen part of our planet. The ocean is warming, more acidic and less productive. Melting glacier and ice sheet are causing sea level rise, and coastal extreme events are becoming more severe. However, urgently reducing greenhouse gas emission limits the scale of ocean and cryosphere changes. Ecosystems and the livelihood that depend on them can be preserved. The science is clear. As a crystal, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, and every choice matters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yuba. If you happen to inform decision makers, please tell them about the science and not only address those who have obviously an issue with science and to keep denying the climate crisis, but also inform those who act like they don't know that we are in a crisis while pretending to stick to the Paris Agreement. It is those who are asked right now to act and to step up. We have now some time for questions. I invite you to address your questions, especially at the scientists on the panel here. We have a microphone over there. So if you may raise your hand if you have a question. Yes, so how about we start over here? Is that okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Mark McCaffrey. I'm with ECOS, which is the Education, Communication, and Outreach Group. And my concern is that we've known about the science for decades, and yet often it's missing completely in school. And I know Greta and you and others have done your homework and learned about how important, how vitally imperative this is that we take action, maybe from what you've learned in school, probably from listening to scientists. But what role do you feel is, especially those of you who are scientists, what role does education play in transforming society to a low-impact, low-carbon lifestyle and society? Because right now, education, the higher education level people have, the higher their environmental impact is. And that, so in other words, education is now actually part of the problem. How do we transform education?
Thank you so much. I suggest we collect a few other questions so we can answer them together. Yes, maybe the lady here waving, and then the one next to that, like you two, yes.
Thank you very much. I work for SupremeMasterTelevision.com. We've been addressing the issue of climate change over the years, and we've talked here about how many forests have been cut and the water that is being wasted. And I wanted to remind people that the report about the livestock long shadow said already that we should cut down on the meat consumption, and that a change to a plant-based diet, like a vegan diet, could actually save the planet, and it's actions that we can take all right now. So I wanted to ask the scientists, I'm sure they're aware of this, but actually it's something that we can do every day, like morning, evening, middle time. And this is an action everybody can take. So I would like to hear if Fridays for Future is doing it and what the scientists think about this. Thank you.
Thank you, and yes, perfect.
Thank you. My name is Nora Lauf. I'm from the Austrian Daily Der Standard. My question is to Mrs. Kletis. You mentioned the UNEP report, according to which nation states have to triple their national action only to reach the 2 degrees goal. Looking back at the first week of COP, do you have the feeling that anything is going into that direction or not at all? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I suggest we pass on the microphone to you. They have a question about education, veganism, and the report to triple ambitions. Whoever feels ask, please. Say whatever you feel is relevant.
Sure. I think the power of science and knowledge is that it gives us, explains the problem, but also gives us a clear sideline to what the solution is, cutting our emissions as quickly and as deeply as possible. So absolutely, we need to do this in the schools from a very young age, but I would say, unfortunately, we need to shake a lot of adults out of the stupor they're in, sort of in this business as usual way in which we're operating. So this kind of knowledge and education is important right down the line from kids up. I've actually been very impressed with young children today who are going out and seeking that knowledge. And it's again, really upsetting to see science get politicized in some contexts so that people don't have access to the right information. In terms of what we can do, obviously, we have to go after this deeply, every one of us, and then as countries. We need to do both, though. I would say we need to make really conscious choices in our daily lives, how we drive our transport, what we eat, all those kinds of things. But make no mistake, without significant action from national governments, we are not going to meet our climate goals. So it's both and we have to keep the pressure on our political leaders.
Yeah, let me just add to that. The urgency is to both stop putting it in. I mean, most of my time on the IPCC was spent on the technological solutions for emissions reduction. About 10 years ago, I began to realize that wasn't going to be enough. And since nature was already doing all of these, removing more than half of what we put in every year, is there any way to increase the capacity of nature to do so? And the answer is yes. Our forests of the world could be absorbing twice as much carbon as they are today. Instead of absorbing a quarter of what we emit, it would be half of what we emit today. And at the same time, if we reduce our emissions, that would really work. What does that require? It requires us letting some trees grow, letting some forests grow. We talk about afforestation, reforestation, great things to do, will make a difference 70 years from now. But it is the trees that are growing now that will rapidly, in the next 10 years, remove substantial amounts of carbon dioxide. We call that process proforestation. And we have to understand that the destruction of biodiversity is not it's nice to have lots of animals and plants around. No, it's essential to the functioning of the natural systems, our forests, our wetlands, our grasslands, our oceans, the biological diversity of species, and yet, what is it, the finding that we've lost 70% of vertebrate species in the last 40, or population, 40% down, or 70% down in 40 years. We are headed in the wrong direction. We really have to take into account the role of the natural world and use our technology to reduce emissions, use the natural world to remove the carbon dioxide. We cannot wait for another decade or 2 decades to build carbon dioxide sucker-uppers that are going to take it out of the atmosphere. We have the capacity now with nature, as long as we don't keep destroying it.
I just want to comment on the question about getting climate into the school curriculums. You know, I'm of an age where I was in middle school when the first Earth Day happened. And it was through a project that we did on recycling that I started to see how we could be taking action to improve the environment. And it's critically important that we get these issues into school curriculums. It's the only way to build the scientific community of the future that will contain the diversity of perspectives that we need. STEM fields are notoriously not gender balanced, and this is a way that we can start to get the scientists of the future kind of entrained on this important issue and its solutions.
And yes, it is extremely important that we get the science in the school curriculum, but also that we educate adults, because as it is now, at least my experience is that pretty much no one is fully aware and has access to the kind of information that we need to have access to, and we cannot translate the science that is available to something that we can relate to. So we need to be able to translate these numbers into grasping the sense of urgency, both children, but also since we can't wait for the children of today to grow up and become the ones in charge, we also need to educate the people who are in charge today and the people who are adults today. So we need to educate everyone.
Just to add on that two aspect, education is very important, and this is why in the IPCC we have a very ambitious outreach program. And then in each of the countries we go for the outreach, explaining the key findings, what are the implications in the country or the region, and then we had interaction with students, with universities, and other the best we can. This is very important. I'm coming from a region in a country, all those who has 20 years old, you don't need science to know that climate is changing. Climate have changed. You see it, you smell it, you live on it, you suffer from it. And then this is clear. And on the, we indicated also in the IPCC report that any choices matters. Eating more meat than anything else is a choice. And then this is, if you go through our report on land, you will find a chapter on food security, nutrition, in detail, different aspects. And then the report do not only speak to the government, it speaks also to the individuals. And then this is very important.
Thank you, sir. Can we pass? Okay.
On the issue of meat does contribute a significant amount to greenhouse gas emissions in how it's produced, in how it's processed, and how it's transported. And reducing meat consumption is one way of reducing one's own emissions, one's own direct emissions. And it's one of many ways that one can reduce one's own direct emissions. Your choices about transport, your choices about what products you consume. And you can have an impact on emissions, you can have an educational impact, you can have a movement-building impact by your choice of lifestyle. But I think it's also important to recognize the limits of trying to fix this broken system one consumer at a time. part of the reason why we don't make those choices is sometimes we can't make those choices. Or those choices simply aren't available, or they're extremely hard to make, or they take such an investment of time and money that it just feels like too much of a sacrifice. And this is because it's not just the eating of a portion of meat, it's the food system that's the problem. It's not just taking a particular trip, it's the transportation system that's the problem. It's our system of manufacturing things and transporting things. And I think this has to be seen in terms of, as has been said before, a system that we've created, a system that many of us have become prosperous on, but which isn't a sustainable system. It's not a model by which the entire world can become prosperous. And in order to have a world in which there isn't perpetual, enormous inequality, which is not a sustainable world, an enclave society like that simply can't last. In order to avoid that dystopian scenario, we need to think about the ways in which the fundamental systems, the industrial systems, the political systems, need to change in order to make a more sustainable world possible.
Thank you. Yes. Yes, we have time for one more question. Okay, let's make a good one. Just on the point of education, like we don't think education like in an abstract way. This is education too. So if you inform decision makers, adults, children, use this opportunity, use what you just heard from some of the best available science and bring it out in the world, because we have no time to wait for school curriculums around the world to have changed. We're sitting here right now, right at this panel, so please join us here. This is why we're here. Okay. Can we have a microphone over there? Can we have like 2 very short questions? Maybe, is it possible? Are we flexible on it? Okay. Over there too.
Sorry. Thank you very much. My name is El Hadj Sheikh Antasek. I am from Senegal. I am the chief publisher of a media online named torchedumonde.com. My question is, what do you advise to Africa that has already discovered natural resources and that need to be developed while having Africa does agree to respect the agreement of Paris? What do you advise the governors, our governance, while we want to respect the environment and while we want to develop our countries with that resources? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Do we have time for like a very quick, tiny one, like a tiny other question just straight after? And then we can answer both?
Which one?
Yeah, now, yes. To maybe the lady over there with the blonde hair.
With the blonde hair?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask how big is the influence of criminal organizations like mafia and close organizations to hinder the people doing something for the environment? I saw a report about the mafia, the Camorra, and there was a telephone call between 2 mafiosi, and the one asked the other one, do you think it's really good to put all this atomic waste from France into the sea at the coast of Calabria? And the other one said, oh, don't think about it, because you will earn so much money you can afford another sea. So this, I wanted to know how far did they already influence us, and are they a part of our system already?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, can we do that? I think it's a really important point. Thank you. Thank you. We'll be quick then. Okay.
Hi, I'll be very fast. I just want to thank you for the school climate strike movement. I think that's moved the needle on this issue more than anything else in the last 18 months, at least. My question is, how can those of us who aren't in positions of power and maybe leaving school, how can the 99%, what's the most direct way we can have an impact and we can make a change?
Thank you so much for this question. So I suggest we have a very quick statement from each of you. Maybe talking about the questions in Africa, the mafia question, if you have thoughts on that, and maybe like a very short recommendation on what should be done in your thought.
On the question of Africa, this is exactly the conundrum we are in, where climate change is exacerbating inequalities that already exist. And what we're not seeing here at the COP is the richer developed nations committing the kind of finance that would be necessary for least developed countries to make a low carbon transition quickly, and moreover to help pay for the loss and damage that these countries are already sustaining because of climate impacts. So there's no reason Africa should be doing this on their own. They're among the nations least responsible for the climate crisis right now. In terms of what young people can do, what you're doing is already amazing because you're changing the politics. We have the technologies. What we have to change is the politics. You're already helping to do that. When you're old enough, wherever you are, please vote. It's the most important thing you can do in democracies. Vote, please.
Yeah, I would just have to echo this. I think there are lots of things we can do. We can all recycle. We can switch out light bulbs, etc. But really, the most important thing is political change. We have a political system that's very, very responsive to those interests that are very happy with the status quo. And that needs to change. And I think it's also it's crucial that you do it in a way that helps you maintain hope. I think that hope is something that will allow this problem to be solved, this transformation to happen. I think that technologies alone, the right policies alone, information alone, that won't do it. I think what we really do need is hope. So as you act, as you take action, as you try and make change, do it with people who can help give you hope.
I'll just add very quickly, like Rachel, I would ask the youth, is there any question that you're not already making a big difference? Look around you. There are hundreds of thousands of people who are listening to the message that you're carrying, especially for science. And the leadership that you're providing is inspirational across the globe.
On what you can do yourself, of course there are many things you can do in your everyday life to reduce your own ecological footprint, but especially to inform yourself and inform others, because right now the gap of the lack of information, the lack of knowledge is so big, and we need to fill that gap. So we need to spread the information, and we need to spread awareness, and we need to start treating this crisis like a crisis, and you can be a part of that, not only as an individual, but also as a small part of a big movement to just put pressure on people in power. And yes, voting is very important, but democracy is not only on election day, it is every second, and public opinion is what runs the free world. So we cannot just sit here and say, oh, I will just wait for election day. You have to do something today, because as a democratic citizen, that is your responsibility.
Well said, as usual. Thank you, Greta. Question came up about criminal activity. There is criminal activity, and here in Europe, I have a colleague working in Eastern Europe, and a lot of the deforestation there for timber and for bioenergy is coming from, among other things, UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and those are criminal activities. But we really should, I agree with Shivan, this has to be about hope. We have to believe that we can make it change, and we can make this change. And I don't want to minimize what each one of us can do, but because if there are a lot of us even doing a little, it adds up to a lot. But we really do have to change the political structure. We have to change the nature of our economy, which rewards doing destructive things that are destroying the planet. And so we need to work on all of those simultaneously. And I find, having worked on this for so long, people ask, don't you get discouraged? Well, I have my bad days, I'll grant you that. But what keeps me going is the opportunities I see to make a difference here, make a difference there, to work with people like we have here on this stage, and with people like you who are out in that audience, to change what has happened. Let's change our society, let's change our economy, let's make those sustainable. And I suggest take a look at the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them. They're not binding, but there are a lot of pretty good ideas there. Thank you.
Okay. For my fellow from Senegal, nous allons discuter ça dans le détail après. I think that we can discuss that in detail later on. But the paradox is that Africa is in a situation where at the juncture actually more possibility exists to jumpstart making development more sustainable and climate compatible. Because the energy system is not yet in place in Africa, you need to build the energy system. The infrastructure that frame your development, you need to build that actually. It is not something that already exists like in an industrialized country. The agricultural system, all of those need to be built actually. We know how to build them more sustainable and climate compatible. There is more opportunity, provided that we take into consideration what Sivan indicated, the equity aspect and the financial element. And then those are very important aspects. I think that we need to keep in mind that climate has not changed in isolation of the changes. And then it will not also change in isolation with the other changes. And then we need to consider all those different aspects. That is why we indicated clearly in our report that there is a need of unprecedented transition in all aspects of the society. It's not incremental, it is not sectorial, it's a profound of those different aspects. That is very important. And some of the African also experts have taken the lead in preparing a renewable energy initiative for the continent, being the LDC and the other that lay out how the continent can jumpstart in a zero carbon world. And then we can have a discussion in those details after the event. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone here. We've come to an end. Thank you so much for joining us today. I just want to finally stress we're here at the COP because people have once decided they need to create a forum to create something that's bigger than the climate crisis and to provide an answer to this crisis. So since we're here at the COP, we need to make sure that they get the best possible outcome out of this COP that is bringing us closer to a more just and safe world for everyone. So while you're here, as you form decision makers, speak to the scientists who are here. There are interviews available after this panel over there with the pink sign. Speak to the youth activists, especially those from the Global South and indigenous community who are also here and happy to talk about their everyday struggle, the fights they're fighting every single day. That is the hope, and that is the people we need to talk to and listen to. This needs to be in the center of what we talk about when we talk about youth mobilizations. And finally, stress and inform decision makers about the need for short-term action happening right here, right now at this COP. This is the opportunity right now. We young people have been mobilizing for an entire year wherever we can, whatever we could do. It is now their time to turn that action into actual political differences, into political processes. So make sure you take this opportunity too, and to understand your responsibility right now to inform, to spread information, and to increase pressure together with us, because this is the opportunity we have right here, right now. Thank you so much. And let's make sure that we get the best out of this opportunity here. Yeah. So the press huddle is over there, with the San Pedro de Atacama place with all scientists. Please make sure you address any potential questions you have.